I have the distinct honor of introducing you to our next speaker, Nancy Rankin. Nancy is a leadership coach with her own company, Nancy Rankin Coaching. She is from Greensboro, North Carolina. She is a church missional and vitality strategist, a resource author for PlougPoint, a pastor, and a retired district superintendent of the Northern Piedmont District in the Western North Carolina Conference. That conference went from 15 down to 8 districts. That was a significant. Ours was 12 to 9. They went from 15 to 8. But they created what they called missional clusters.
Networks.
And she brings a lot of her experience over the last, they call what?
Networks.
Networks, missional networks. We keep going around with different names. She brings a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge of working with missional networks, missional hubs to us. So we are grateful. The strategy team had heard from Myron Wingfield, who was at the time at Discipleship Ministries in Nashville and has since moved to Cal PAC conference and working. And that was where the envision of missional hubs happened. But honestly, when I started networking with other conferences, I would ask, well, tell me about your missional networks, your missional hubs. How did it go? How was it fruitful? How did you make it happen? And I'd get, we tried that and it didn't work. I was losing a little bit of confidence there for a while. And I've had a team of people praying with and for me in this process and in the strategy team's process in launching missional hubs. And I said, God, I need somebody who knows how to do this because we need to learn and glean from their experiences. Well, I happened to go to a networking with other conference leadership, was scheduled to go to one workshop, but at the last minute changed to a different workshop. I think that was a God thing. And I sat down. And the workshop was, what is your God-inspired, Jesus-inspired vision? And I said, well, our God-inspired, Jesus-inspired vision in the hosting conference is missional hubs, because it's going to take all of us working together with God to make it happen. Nancy leans over. I even happen to be sitting next to her. She leans over and says, let's talk. I've been doing it for 6 or 7 years. And I looked at her and I said, really? You're a godsend, Nancy. So I really appreciate that she could come this weekend and be with us and share her experiences. They have been doing it for 7 years, 8 years, 6 years.
6 years.
6 years. And they have begun to see the fruitfulness of diversity in churches, of partnerships and vital mergers, bringing persons into a living relationship with Jesus Christ, discipling others to disciple others. We are grateful for your ministry. She says the relationships, the congregations have formed lower barriers around race and competition and allow new ideas and ministries to happen. She regularly blogs about her experiences, and she has led others in this vital ministry that we are launching. We're grateful that she and her husband Terry are with us this weekend, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, in your packet, you have the outline of the PowerPoint, if you want to pull that out. And I, too, wrote one of those position papers that you can use to go to sleep with at night, and that's in here, too. And I want to echo a word that's already been said several times, and that is the word excited. I come to bring you good news, good tidings of great joy around having missional networks or hubs. And yes, we had people who were skeptical. It is not an overnight thing. But the beauty of it is it grows the way God leads it, and you just persist. So one of the best things that happened to us was that we, like you, determined that this was how we were going to do life as a conference. That if we were going to transition from 15 districts down to 8, we sure as heck couldn't do things the way we had always done it. It changed the way we superintended. It changed the way we were going to function as a church. And it has issues, and I'll share those with you too. But I just want to encourage you to say, to me, it is the reclamation of being Wesleyan connectional people, and it's biblical. Imagine. So I went from 7 years ago when I was asked to come back on the district. I did 2 tours of duties as a district superintendent. So some people say I am certifiable, and it's true. But one of the reasons I think that Bishop Goodpastor asked me to come on that second time was because I had been a district superintendent, but I was also congregational development person for 4 years, and I love strategy. That's my leading gift on Strength Finder. I love working and moving into new things, especially when it furthers the kingdom. When you see people connect and come together, it just energizes you. And so I took a big gulp when I discovered that, oh, you're going from 63 churches in your Salisbury district to 154 in the Northern Piedmont district. And we were like, oh, Lord, have mercy. But we did it with, in my district, we had 13 missional networks. Most of them had about 10 to 12 churches each. And I will kind of unpack how we made all that work. But what I want to emphasize to you is that the important thing of saying that we've committed to do this as a conference. And our bishop said repeatedly, I expect the pastors to participate and bring your laity with you. That meant everything, to be able to say, we have collectively committed to this. Now let's give it our best effort. So part of this was an affirmation that we had made a commitment and that we wanted lay people to be as empowered in this process as the clergy. So if you'll go ahead and go to the next one. I prepared this as a teaching tool. Anything I share with you today, take or leave however it's helpful. I am fully aware you need to live into this in your context, just like we had to. In fact, our districts varied on how we did this, and each network was a little different because they're all contextual. So please hear that. But this was a basic teaching tool to remind people, because some of the skepticism we got in early on was, oh, is this another one of those quadrennial emphasis? You know, the ones that you live into about the 3rd year and then they turn around and change the darn thing and you got to start all over again. So one of the things we had to do was to say, this is not a seasonal thing. We are so committed to this and feel so led to this way of relating to each other. This is going to be the way we're going to do life for the foreseeable future until Jesus comes, more or less. But we were reminding people, this is a biblical mandate. And so we began with reminding people of some core values of how this was going to happen. Great Commission. Jesus said, go and make disciples. But you know, a lot of churches have already changed the Great Commission to what I call the Great Invitation in the Southern sense. Y'all come and we promise to be nice. This is what we saw again and again. Churches were fine if you'd be willing to come to us. But we're not going out there. But we will put something out on the marquee and say, y'all should come. So we, at the very beginning, had to remind people that we are a sent church. The other thing that people kept hoping for was if we just had enough program, or if we just built the right building, or my all-time favorite in consultations with PPR committees, if you'd just send us a young male preacher with a darling wife who plays the piano and has 3 or more perfectly well-behaved children, then all of the young adult families in our whole community will just fall right through the door. Don't we wish? It doesn't happen that way. But there's a lot of belief that that is what making a disciple is about. The other thing our people suffered from was, for generations, evangelism for them was reproductive evangelism. We will have children. They will follow our place. Maybe by the time they're 56, we'll let them have our office as the chair of finance. And that's the way we'll grow our church. Our children will take our places. You know how well that's worked, especially in the last 2 generations. Again, in a lot of my consultations, people would say, we used to have all these children. I mean, one family would take up the whole pew. And I would say to them, remember, 2 words came into being: birth control. The Joneses. The Joneses no longer have 8 to 10 children. And here's the sad part that so many of our churches are waking up to. The children grew up and they went away to find jobs. The jobs aren't here anymore. And in all that time, there were children growing up around us, but we forgot to fall in love with them too. Amen. So here we are, a church full of older folk, wondering how in the world we're going to get kids in the door. Going out. Next core value, that love God and love the neighbor thing. Well, we had a whole lot of retooling to do in that area too, because the neighbor doesn't look like us anymore. The neighborhood changed. In our world, and in your world too, we've become a huge move-in destination for people in retirement, people following the grandchildren. It's just a heck of a nice place to live. And so suddenly, all those foreigners are here. You know, the Yankees. We don't know how to relate to people who are different from us. And here's the other thing. So many of my inner city churches, the people grew up in those houses in that neighborhood, but mom and dad died. The kids sold the house. They no longer live there, but they drive back on Sunday. So you go in and you say to this group of older adults, you really ought to engage the neighbor. What do you mean? We don't live here. We just come in on Sunday. So what are you going to do? How do you turn that around? Love God, love the neighbor. Well, one of the important things that we've had to do in these last 6 years is retool how you reach people. New people in new places, people that we've not interacted with before. We used a lot of asset-based community development training. That's happened in the last 2 years in particular. And I recommend to you Peter Block's book called Community. He's an ABCD person, asset-based community development. And there's a mantra that he uses that you consider everybody coming to your table with equal value, equal voice, and that the people who come have gifts just as important as the ones you think you need to give to them. Next one. So, a core value. Christian relationships. Now, this is paragraph 201 in your book of discipline. And I highly recommend, and have said this to pastors, a great preaching series would be on paragraphs 201 through 204 in the book of discipline, because it says, what is the purpose and the function of a church? Do you realize how many of your folk have never heard the whole list in those paragraphs of what a church ought to be about? Most of them think it's multiple choice. But at the very end, it says all of these things that a church should be doing are a minimum expectation of the local church. Our folk have not heard that. So it's a great time to remind them we're called to a cooperative relationship with each other. So often our folk have seen mission as writing a check or doing a handout. We really pushed hard that if you were going to engage your community in mission, that the first thing you were going to do was establish a relationship with the people you hope to serve. And it says in my position paper, as quickly as possible, you learn their names, you listen to their stories, you invite them to become servers with you. Equalizing, honoring their gifts. Recognizing that sometimes we don't really know what's best for the other person until we've sat down and let them tell us. The next one, core value, is about cooperation. And the exciting thing that happened to us was that the cooperation part among our churches is what caught on the quickest. People were really excited about the idea that together we could do something that would impact our community. We had them do their mission insight studies. We had them to pray about it and to say, where could we begin? And we were talking about not just meeting a need, but actually improving the PR of the church and the community so that we had influence again. That we could actually impact the way policy is being made in a local community. That we could speak up and say, why are we a food desert? In the area around High Point and Greensboro is second in the nation in food deserts. It's one thing to say, let's get some food here. It's another thing to say, why the heck is that happening? And what could we be doing differently? Our two cabinets, the North Carolina Conference and the Western North Carolina Conference, met regularly together. And one of the things we did was to go to NC State University, their emerging initiative group, and say, teach us about food. Help us with our churches that are trying to address food scarcity. What are y'all learning? And to start tapping in. And here's the other piece about cooperation. All of my churches, my networks that identified food as one of their critical areas, they started, I'll give you one quick example. Church in Randleman, it was the Methodist churches in the beginning. But very quickly, the community wanted to be a part of it. So the fire department and the police department signed up to do a meal. The chief of the fire department, the chief of the police were brothers. So it became a competition. Who was going to have the best food and serve the most people? And so they expanded the idea of, similar to what you had on your video, let's not just serve the folk who show up. Everybody come bring us the name of a shut-in and we'll take food. So they got to where they were serving over 400 people, counting 70 they were taking the food to. And it was a great competition, but that wasn't enough. The teachers at the elementary school wanted to be a part of it. The Boy Scout troop decided to, and then the Baptists weren't about to be outdone. It became ecumenical. And there's this great video that we have where the mayor of Randleman says, this has become the center of our community. The Methodists did that. I'm just a little proud. So we got these core values. So what does that say about how you function? Next one. Well, obviously you got to be missional. And I'm using a quote there from Alan Hirsch. You know, God is a sending God. And through the church is the instrument of God's mission. That there really isn't an option about this thing of whether we should get out and get involved. Next one, key function. We're going to do this together. In our world, we called it networking. You can call it hubs, you can call it clusters. Doesn't really matter what you call it as long as it works. And for us, the networking, it took a while. You've seen those illustrations where you've got early adapters, the folk who wait a little bit and then they'll come along. Then you got the folk who are really standing back. And then you got the ones who ain't never going to get on. I had all of that among preachers and laity. So what happened? I decided I don't want to be heavy-handed about this because people don't usually like to be threatened in order to do something. Way back in the day when I took Psychology 101, they said positive behavior modification works better. So we decided we'll just tell all the great stories. As quickly as we get one, we'll tell it. We'll affirm the folk who did it, and it begins to influence and inspire. And we did it that way. Did I have some folk who are, well, just because the conference said it ain't going to do it? Okay, we just work on past you. For those of you who have churches that don't want to be a part of the network, we'll just keep nudging. We'll actually host something maybe at their church. Let them hear the stories. One of the ways our networks function was that this is where I did my church conferences. Now, very briefly, I let them do business of church conference, electing officers, approving candidates, budgets, that sort of thing at home. I could send an elder if they needed an elder. What we did at these charge conferences for the networks was that wonderful piece that often gets overlooked in charge conferences called Celebration of Ministries. And so we made it a glorious celebration. It was a worship setting, but I told them, and I've got that outlined in there too, have the best music, the most exciting stuff you can. This is going to be wonderful. And you're going to have great food. So we did worship, and this was on a Sunday afternoon, and as quickly as we could, part of that was a testimony from somebody in the community who had been impacted by the work of the network. Wow. So, quick example, had a network that identified an entire elementary school that did not have a backpack program. Now we're talking, this network of people were all small churches. By the time they were finished, well, I was having to leave the district, they'd gone from serving 30 families to over 100. And part of the funding for that did not come from the people in those churches. It came from people in the community who were so darn impressed with what they were doing that said, I want to add the families y'all can serve. And they wrote the checks. Don't ever underestimate what people will be willing to contribute to. You've heard the old adage, money follows vision. It does. At that charge conference, after they'd been doing this for a while, the principal brought the children's choir from the school to sing at the charge conference. Many of them had never been in a church. They sang Frozen, which was just way cool. Let it go. And then a mom, single mom with 3 kids who had been the recipient of those weekend backpacks full of food to get them through that tough, long weekend, stands up and tells those people what a dramatic difference it had made in the lives of her 3 children. Do you think we had to argue about whether they were going to be part of the backpack program anymore? This is what I mean. You put the positive stories out there as quickly as you can. Next one. Key function. I treated network leaders similarly to the Wesleyan class leader. This is where it helped me as a superintendent. I asked that each of my network leaders be the clergy and their lay leader, so that there was lay representation from the beginning. But I also said, particularly to that clergy person, you're also kind of the chaplain for your network. If I'm not available to go visit the pastor in your network who's had a death in the family, who's in the hospital, who's got a new baby, you're going to show up and do that. Or you'll designate another pastor in your network to go do that. I learned real quickly that first year, Terry and I faithfully tried to visit everybody who moved into the parsonage. You know, the way we used to do it. Remember? This is when I learned the way you used to do it ain't going to work anymore. And I had such great ideas. I mean, we take a loaf of bread, have a card that says, you know, I'm praying for you that you will break forth the bread of life to your new people. We had a carload. Folks, I was moving 40 and 50 people. I still thought I could visit the ones who came to the parsonage. At 9:30 that night, we had to stop. The bread, some of it was still in the car. And I said, dummy, you can't do this by yourself anymore. Oh, the network leader should have been the first one at the parsonage today to introduce them, say, I'm your go-to person, and you'll get to meet the rest of the network. And then 2 weeks later, Nancy had orientation for all the new pastors that had moved in to explain the missional network, how we function, let them meet each other. Classic example. Stop doing it by yourself. Use these people. They love doing it. And it built their relationships, because here's the other thing we discovered. When they came together for those first missional network gatherings, those charge conferences, and they were sitting down to eat, these people were within 5 or 10 miles at the most from each other. They didn't know each other. They were sitting there introducing themselves to each other. How embarrassing. United Methodists, for crying out loud, didn't know each other. Some of the pastors were reluctant to be vulnerable with each other. So we had to grow all of that. And this is where we saw the barriers start to come down. which opened up all kinds of things we could do. Part of what the missional network leaders did, which is kind of similar to a class leader too, was that we told them to study their neighborhoods together. So that network leader had to be, in a sense, a type of missional strategist, but also somebody who convened people in active prayer for the community and for themselves. One group was so foreign to each other, their first few meetings were to meet in each other's churches and simply pray for each other in their congregations. You see what we were taking away? Competition. We were trading competition for cooperation and compassion for one another. Then we're going to start celebrating when you get 10 new members or when you have a great ministry, because in a lot of cases, we've now done that together. Next one. A key function of working cooperatively with the district and the conference, maybe it's only in our conference you run into this, but we had some folk who, just kind of want to pride themselves on, I'm the rebel and I don't really have that much to do with the district and the conference. Well, what we tried to say, and we reoriented a lot of what we were doing at the conference level, we're here to be your resource. You're the front line. You, the local church. We serve you. We're here to help you do kingdom things. And we're doing this together. It made a huge difference in how people responded. And I think we reclaimed a lot of that sense of connectional cooperation. So, quick recap. The core values were going out, love of God and neighbor, Christian relationships, and cooperation among churches. And let me add one more thing. Not only did our outreach become ecumenical, but we began to intentionally develop partnerships with community groups and other nonprofits so that we weren't reinventing the wheel. We didn't begin to get into homeless outreach without talking to social services. So that we would be doing this in concert with them, not against them or ignorantly, not knowing really what we were doing, to ask people to come in and teach us. Key functions. We're going to be missional. We're going to network. We're going to function like Wesleyan class leaders. And we're going to give up this whole thing of this resentment of the district and the conference, and we're going to work together. Now, did we accomplish all of that? No, but I do believe the kingdom will come. It just takes time. Now, I've already mentioned, so I want to push on. I'm aware of my time, more or less. I didn't get to start right at quarter till. So, this is in your notes. The clergy and lay leaders as Wesleyan class leaders, I've talked about that. I tried to write this in such a way for my churches it was as simple as possible. And one of the first, I said, you got 2 questions to deal with. And I kept it the same the whole 6 years, which was also going past the quadrennial emphasis that, oh, okay, y'all finally caught on, now we're going to all switch it up. No, I said we're going to be consistent and just keep saying the same thing over and over and affirming when we made success and keep undergirding it. Because you realize in 6 years' time, I had pastors who came and went, and you had to keep training. So I trained my missional network leaders. I visited the networks. I had 2 big training events once I got them up and going. One was in May, and I laid out all the fall charge conference expectations then. So nobody could say, I didn't know. So that they were set for that. But at that May event, they all turned in the things they had been doing so everybody knew what everybody else was doing. And that way they were cross-pollinating, they were inspiring each other, and they were encouraging each other. Then, after charge conference, I would have meetings. I'd pull my network leaders back together, and this would be early December to say, how are we doing? How did the fall go? What would you change? What do you need to be doing as your next step? So like I said, we had 2 questions. First one, how can we help one another become more effective for God's kingdom work? And this could be really practical. Do you have curriculum you're not using anymore that you'd let us use? We've only got 2 teenagers, and you've only got 1, but that church over there has 2. What if we just went together and did youth ministry? What if we did vacation Bible school together? What if? What are some things that you have? You got folk who want to take Bible study. I got people who'd be happy to teach it. Those kind of things. And then number 2, I've already talked about, how can we work together to better minister to the communities we serve in common? As I said earlier, they answered number 2 almost immediately with vigor and excitement, and it continued to grow. Number 1 was the hard one. You know why? We hate to admit we need any help. Pride. So we tried to be very gentle about all that, and part of that was those folks getting together and just praying for each other. Started lowering those barriers so they could trust each other. I also tried to emphasize, we're not trying to be punitive towards you if you don't fully get into this in the beginning. Everything about, remember, positive behavior modification. Once they got to know each other better, then number 1 became easier and easier. Let's go to vital. That's 2 more down. There you go. We developed a scorecard. Reggie McNeil came out with his book, The Renaissance, and he said you need to rewrite the scorecard for churches. So that was when I was doing congregational vitality after I'd done congregational development. But vitality was after I was back in a church as a pastor, so that was my volunteer job for the conference. Our team put together this scorecard, and I can send it to you electronically if you would care to look at it. But we took Bishop Snazy's 5 practices of fruitful congregations and asked the questions of churches about that kind of fruitfulness. So the questions were things like, well, I'll give you the quick part. If you look at how we broke down the word vital, vital churches are following a prayerfully discerned vision of God, a vision. They are inspirational and incarnational, Jesus in the world. People can say their life was impacted by that church. Transformation is what's happening. It's a sign of the fruit. You know the classic question, if your church was blown away tomorrow, would anybody miss you? That's a great question for people to wrestle with. Transformation, is it happening? And then Reverend Hendy's word last night, are you willing to be adaptive? And finally, we all think we're loving until the stranger walks in. Are we really? So that thing, it's a multi-fold scorecard that comes out and has all those categories. So anyway, we use that. And then, next one. We began to also push not just missions to people, but disciple making. And I asked my churches, if a person joined your church tomorrow as a new Christian, what are the steps you have in place to lead them to a deeper, mature relationship with Jesus Christ? And most people would look at me and say, I think maybe adult Sunday school. Well, look around at adult Sunday school these days, folks, and see how well that's going to be the vehicle for doing this. So we didn't come up with the magic answer to this, but the biggest part for us was to ask the question and keep pushing for, are you developing discipleship systems? Let me finish now. I mentioned that we did the asset-based community development training. I had a church vitality strategist, CVS, you know us and our acronyms. She was certified in ABCD, and she was a United Methodist elder. So one of the things, after we were about 3 to 4 years into this, was this whole thing of people still not knowing exactly how to engage people different. So part of her training with the networks was around asset-based community development. So let me tell you some of the best outcomes that came of this after 6 years. That lowering of those barriers. We ended up doing 12 cross-racial appointments in my district. And you know how they worked so beautifully? Because the people had worked together. Many of my African American pastors were traveling 20 to 40 miles to serve a 2-point charge. Why? Perpetuated segregation. Black churches down here, 20 miles up here is the other one, and they're doing this. Well, There was a white church right here. I mean, right here. Less than 2 miles apart. But through the network, they started intentionally doing things together that they had not done before. The white church is a station church. You know how people are about being a station church. They didn't need anybody else. A lot of prayer went into all of this. So I go in and I say, had talked to the pastors ahead of time. The pastors immediately said, oh yeah, we'd do that. We'd do cross-racial. That's not a problem. In fact, one of them looked at me and he says, Nancy, did you have any way of knowing I did this as a student pastor? I said, no, I had no way of knowing. That's the God part. But here's you take that, suck in all that breath and you pray all the way to that white church's meeting where you're going to walk in and say to a strong station church, I want you to go on a 2-point charge with an African American church next door. You don't need to be on a 2-point charge. You don't need the hassle. And I'm asking you to share your pastor. You know what they said that night? Well, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we? Wasn't what I was expecting. All my arguments. Oh, man. It's kind of like, could we stand and pray? They're still on that 2-point charge. And they have a new pastor who's thinking it's just fine. And we had all kinds of configurations. We had white serving black, and they actually reversed. I mean, it just went. But I'm telling you, it was a result of this network experience that I'm convinced made that possible. We did amazing partnerships. One of the things we began to cast was, if you're a strong, healthy church, you have an obligation to be helping struggling churches. Amen. It's not okay for you to drive by and say, we're doing great, too bad about you. And I said to large church pastors, you know, it's no longer enough for you to arrive and just be the ensconced preacher. I want you out in the community making a difference. Change the whole concept of what it means to get to be promoted to senior pastor of First Church. So, the largest church in my district, Christ Church in Greensboro, I had a struggling new church start, St. Timothy. They were 20 years old and grown to 50 people in Greensboro. That's growing like crazy. So I went over to them because they had helped start that church 20 years before. I said to the pastor, do you want your baby back? I said, St. Timothy's in trouble, but I think if you would pour yourselves into them for a little while, we could turn that corner. And they did. And it did. And they shared the pastor. St. Timothy got 3/4 time. They got 1/4 time of that pastor, helped with visitation in the super large church. People from the large church go over and help St. Timothy with confirmation, outreach to the neighborhood, begin to see it come back and to grow. Our conference didn't know what to call it. The only thing it could have been, by our reasoning, is a 2-point charge. So the largest church in my district became a 2-point charge. And then when I'd have to go out and meet with churches about the fact they needed to go on a charge, and they would say, oh, we couldn't possibly, that's such a demeaning thing. And I had such fun saying, Christ Church Greensboro is on a 2-point charge. Partnerships. So we began the concept of seasonal. For a season, we can journey with each other. Christ Church has since that time gone into one of those inner city neighborhoods where the folk don't live there anymore. They're all in their 80s. And yet it's a fast-growing part of Greensboro. And they decided there, it wasn't going to be just partnership, it was going to be a marriage, a merger for always. And that's what they've done. And they're saving an inner city church we didn't need to lose. See, one of the questions I always ask is this a place we do not want to lose Wesleyan theology? Is this a property that can still impact other people? And I knew how much we needed to do it when I met with that group. And I said, do you realize there's 93,000 people within 3 miles of your church? And you know what one of them said to me? But they didn't grow up here. That's when I knew merger was the thing to do. We had our first cross-racial merger. Anglo church, African American church, you could throw a ball from one to the other. And I loved what they put in their merger covenant. They said for 125 years we have been side by side, separated only because of race, We no longer find that acceptable. That was in their covenant. They wrote it. We used Innovate UMC. Reverend Handy talked about that. Innovate was something we got out of the emerging issues from NC State. It's a business model, but briefly, you do quick experiments, you get in, you try it, and you learn from it. So they did. And one of the things they were trying was this conversation between the white church and black church, and they became part of their transition team for that merger to happen. We started a neighborhood seminary, a 2-year certificate program. This was done in partnership with Duke Divinity School when Elaine Heath was still there. And it was revolutionizing the way we did lay ministry training. We started a school of spiritual direction, and it was a 2-year certification program for our clergy to be certified as spiritual directors, because that was something the pastors identified they needed. 8 of our pastors are in their 2nd year of that. We did a lot of work with racial reconciliation with the Beloved community, which is located in downtown Greensboro. We have a very checkered past and, quite frankly, a present where racial issues are huge. And we brought, interestingly enough, all of our downtown clergy who were white males, and brought in our African American clergy as well as lay people, and spent 3 days claiming the reality of white supremacy, white privilege, and what was the church going to do about it, and how were we going to do it in that community. So that's it. But what I hope to tell you is it's ongoing. I retired in July. It's still going on. It's still different in different places in our district. I will share that in the Blue Ridge district, the Asheville area, there is a whole missional network that is now their idea, saying we need to be a cooperative parish, and we're going to put that together. It's inspiring to watch what happens when you empower people and let it go. We always said we're not going to tell the network what specifically to do, just give them the structure through which God will work in them, and what they birth is theirs. And that's what our experience has been. And one last thing started to happen. We realized that if we want to meet the needs of today's families, we've got to do Sunday plus. So we began to see churches start weeknight worship services with a meal. This wasn't a meal particularly about hunger. This was a meal about reality of working families that come straight from work, pick up the kids, and they can go get a meal and a worship service. And dadgummit, they've been to church. And the next thing you know, what we had happening was networks saying, we can make this happen. We can start doing church as a network. Now, what we'll eventually call all that, I don't know. I'll let the newer generation figure all that out. But it gives me hope, because guess what these churches started experiencing? The growth of those young families with children they kept seeking. They were right there in the neighborhood. Many times they just walked right over. And they had church, and they got fed spiritually and physically. Thank you.
If you would share with us a little bit about how elders partnered with you in those hubs to care for that hub, to build community and relieve some stress from the DNs.
And why don't you just, when you, Todd, like when you stand up, say who you are, and
Okay.
just because.
I'm sorry, Todd Chansey, Tennessee Valley District, pastor at Kingston United Methodist Church.
I got mine. Part of it was training the network leaders that this was an expectation, and making sure, that they were okay about that. It was part of the training of the network leaders that this was an expectation, and so they had to kind of agree to that, before I could talk them into being a leader. The other thing was, once I trained, especially those first 3 to 4 years, I was very intentional about me itinerating around. When they would do their network meetings, I was the one that I would tell them when I was coming, so that if they had questions of me, or if I had picked up on some things I wanted to make them aware of, we would do that in those gatherings. And the beauty of that kind of visit from the district superintendent, it wasn't a business meeting, it wasn't charge conference. I'm not here to do anything other than listen and participate. which let me build relationships in ways with churches I hadn't been able to do before, because at least I was seeing maybe 10 to 12 churches at one time in that gathering. See, each pastor was to bring their lay leader to that meeting, or some lay person who wanted to do that kind of work. So that's one of the ways that it built. And again, the beauty of it was, that experience, one experience builds on the next and the next. And then the affirmation of people, so that their name got lifted. But I felt really comfortable with just picking up the phone and spur of the moment say, I just found out, Jane went in the hospital. Can you please cover that for me? I'm in cabinet meeting or whatever. And they just did it. And I mean, in fact, most of them were grateful, first of all, to know their colleagues, so they knew about it, but they got the word around to the network, and the whole network could respond appropriately, to their neighbor, which again built that relationship.
Brooke Ashley, Church and Community Worker Missionary, Clinch Mountain District. I've heard you talk a lot about elders being the leaders of these hubs. I'm wondering your thought about station. Would it be more important that you're an elder, or have the qualities that you would look for in a missional hub leader? Would you consider local pastors, deacons? I want to make sure that we're all clear on that.
Thank you. Thank you for making me be more specific. I had all of the above. I had local pastors who were network leaders. I did not have a deacon who was a network leader, but I could have. For us, in fact, here was the beauty of the lay people. I had networks where the lay leader was more the leader than the clergy, because they had the passion. Some of them were better organized. We use the gifts however they come. And I was thrilled with that. I mean, there were just certain networks that I knew it was lay run more than it was clergy, and that's okay. I mean, that was part of it. But thank you for that. I didn't mean to just say elder all the time. That was probably just a bad habit. No, we had all of the above.
Monty Walton, pastor at Hillcrest United Methodist Church in the Smoky Mountain District. Help me understand your successes and failures in defining what a hub looked like. Number of churches in a hub, physical proximities, sizes. Was there something you could help us think about?
Geography was where we started, because we thought close proximity could impact the common served community. We also said, and the bishop, when we started this, it was Bishop Goodpastor, and Bishop Leland continued it, we said the lines are fluid and flexible. That if it made more sense for 4 churches on the north end to do something with 4 churches over there, do it. It was okay. As we got into this more, there began to be more identification with some of them around affinity, meaning people doing food ministries, where other people wanted to do racial reconciliation. Then they kind of formed a natural thing. So it was fluid. We also said to people, every year, we purposely redrew lines around what people told us. For instance, they would say it makes more sense for us to be over here than where you put us. Then we'd move them. Because for us, it wasn't about the lines as about effectiveness. So that's what I meant by we stayed fluid and flexible. And it'll continue to evolve that way. Probably even more so around the affinity piece. Now, in my district, that's easier to pull off because we were, I was going to say, of the 8 districts, I had the smallest geography. So we were closer. So we could do more of that direct community kind of things. My counterpart in our Blue Ridge district had 11 counties. So theirs had to be, while it was still geography, they could do sometimes when they were 10 or 20 miles apart, they could do less in terms of specific regular community things, like a common meal that would happen every week or something. That would be more of a single town kind of thing. That's where being ecumenical matters even more. You know, hook up with the Baptists and the Episcopalians if you don't have enough Methodists around. Yeah.
Hey, my name is Evelyn Harris. I'm the pastor at St. Luke United Methodist. And perhaps I'm just dense and I'm not really getting this, but Could you be more specific about how exactly these missional hubs fulfill the mission and the vision of the church, and maybe what exactly the mission and the vision are that we're trying to fulfill here? Like, what is our end goal in these missional hubs?
Ultimately, we wanted to make disciples of Jesus Christ. But you better have a relationship with somebody before you start into the Jesus conversation. Or at least give them an experience of Jesus. And so we, from the very beginning, even though our second question was missional, we said, and how will yours look different than the Rotary Club? And how will they know Jesus was there? We also did a lot of talk around, are you at a place where you could share your faith? Well, you won't be surprised that particularly among a lot of our congregations, they'll say, no way, I don't know how to do that. So we realized that a lot of what we needed to be doing was equipping people about faith sharing at a comfort level. But that was always the driving fit. I mean, we didn't change the mission of the church. Follow Jesus, make disciples for the transformation of the world. We were very clear that that's what we were about. And you had a second part to that about, I'm sorry.
I think you answered them both at the same time.
Okay, good. Good.
Yes, I'm Linda Stransky, Mountain View District Church and Community Worker Missionary. And I was wondering if we could just go back a question. And you were talking about one of the hubs being like 11 counties. Can you give us some examples of ways, other than support of one another, that a missional hub that really has very separate areas and communities might work together?
Okay, the hub wasn't 11 counties, the district was.
Oh, okay.
The district covered 11 counties. So,
Well, what about when churches are very far from one another in different communities?
well, and that's what they often experience in those areas where they're more spread out. That's where we said the partnership with your immediate community becomes even more important. That it's not just a Methodist thing. It's a, who do we walk alongside who is trying to do similar things? And this helped a lot as a model to the community, that we're no longer, again, not only competing among each other, we're not competing with the Baptist or the Episcopal. We're all in this together. And a lot of that centered around common outreach, back to school endeavors, supplies to school classrooms. Those are things that could be done by whole groups of not only churches, but like I said, from Randleman, get the police department and fire department involved, the teachers, all of that. So it just became, partnership became a much more emphatic necessity in those kind of situations where you don't have a Methodist church within 2 or 3 miles. Yeah.
Hi, Linda Schumann, Mountain View District. And do you find churches only focus on being in one missional hub, or if it's a large church, might they be involved in more than one hub? For example, a hub that's working primarily with school children, and maybe another one that's feeding or working with opioid addiction or something like that, where there's more focus.
In the beginning, as churches were living into this, it was primarily a one thing, but they tended to grow. One of the things, though, that I said to churches, and it's in that positional paper, we're not looking for you to be overly busy. We would rather you did fewer but did them deeper. That you developed relationships that lasted a long time. So we really didn't push for lots and lots and lots of things. Most of our large churches already had too much going on anyway. And so convincing them to do this, it had to kind of dovetail with something they were already excited about. That's not to say those kind of things didn't happen. They began to later on. Like I said, that's where the affinity began to arise. Common affinity of doing food ministry or school ministry or reading programs. We had a whole group of churches that decided, and they got a grant from Duke Endowment to do a summer reading program for the whole community. But that evolved. So yes, all of that's possible. I mean, the beauty of this is you know, the Holy Spirit gets hold of people, just all kinds of wonderful things can happen. The caution I had for my pastors and laity was, we're not about trying to make you busy. We want to make you effective. So we would rather you spent your energy. Oh, here's the other trade-off I did about pastors being involved in missional networks. I did away with monthly clergy meetings because I said to them, I would rather you put your energy and your presence in your missional network than checking in with me every month. That's what email is for, and a phone call and me visiting you. But I will not make you sit through monthly clergy meetings anymore. That was an old model. I would rather you, recognizing that I can't ask you to add more. I need to help you take more off your plate so you can do this new thing. And I had to do that too. I was having to learn to take things off my plate.
Thank you, Nancy. Greatly appreciate
Thank you.
this.